Ladies and gentlemen, this gaming.com video. Yes, say it with me folks, we're going to be further discussing the Xbox One and resolution. It seems that we can't do anything else recently. Various developers have been weighing in on this, and that's pretty much what I said just yesterday, you may remember. And now a lot of developers have started to speak about this, and there's been a lot of movement. This includes various posts on Twitter, magazine interviews, and much more besides. One of the things that we're going to discuss, first of all, is Call of Duty Ghosts. Now, there have been varying reports on this one. Jeremy Conrad, for example, has said, and I quote, "People say that 720p isn't a big deal compared to 1080p, but an FPS drop from 60 to 50 is the reason not to buy it. P.S. The game, the 720p game has worse drops." Now, that is in regards, of course, to Call of Duty on the Xbox One running in 720p, but it's not as the developers originally claimed of it being 60 frames per second pretty much all the time. Indeed, apparently there are frame rate drops. Now, just how bad they are seems to vary. At the moment, the reports are fairly, well, up and down. Some people in the media have been claiming that the drops are pretty damn bad, and others are saying that it's not really that noticeable at all. Furthermore, in regards to the PlayStation 4 version, which of course runs at 1080p for Call of Duty Ghosts, it still does actually suffer with some FPS drop. However, according to the rumours and the comments so far, it's not as bad as the Xbox One version. I'm not quite sure who to believe on that one right now because, as I said, there are conflicting reports, folks. So let's get it out of the way. Dead Rising 3 for the Xbox One has been finally fully and officially confirmed at 720p at 30 frames per second. Now, once again, there is some conflicting reports on this, with one website reporting that pretty much all of the time they were managing to run the title, Dead Rising, in 1080p for the Xbox One, but when a huge amount of zombies were on screen at once, and a lot of carnage was happening, for example, fire effects, that type of thing, they would notice the frame rate started to chug. Regardless, Josh Bridge has confirmed, by the way, he is an executive producer at Capcom, Vancouver, and he has confirmed that the frame rate is now going up and up and up, and they've got it now locked at 30 frames per second. And this is, and I quote, "and that's just purely on the effort of all aspects of the team, the engineering team, and our own team, all trying to optimize, and that's what always happens at the last steps of the development of a product." Also, the question was asked in regards to how much the Xbox One hardware has changed, and Josh said that it's primarily just the clock speed boost, which of course was announced just after E3. But aside from that, the hardware hasn't really changed at all. It's actually been primarily the evolution of the actual software. This, of course, would be the core drivers and the actual UI and the operating systems, and as well as the actual tools that actually give the developers to improve things. It's not really especially surprising. I mean, come on now. The tools are not exactly that advanced. Now, supposedly, the rumours have it that the Xbox One's tools were actually behind that of the PlayStation 4's. However, Microsoft have been doing a lot of catch-up, and not exactly to the point where they have a level of parity with the PlayStation. In other words, they're not exactly the same. They're not as advanced, but they're certainly getting a hell of a lot better. Josh also said that the native resolution is 720p, and I'm really happy with it. With the sheer amounts of stuff we have in an open world game locked at 30 frames per second, that's just brilliant. He also pointed out that the UI, in other words the user interface, runs natively at 1080p on top, but they're locked at 720p at 30 frames per second. It's actually worth remembering that the Xbox One can actually render 3 different buffers at different resolutions. And so they could put the UI buffer in one, they can put the rest of the game in another, and the third is actually reserved for the operating system. It's also worth noting that, of course, The Xbox One does support dynamic resolutions, however, Dead Rising does not do that. In case you're not exactly familiar with what dynamic resolutions are, it's pretty simple. Developers will target a specific frame rate, and let's just make it easy and let's not deal with sub-resolutions like 900p. Let's just use resolutions like, 1080p and 720 just for the sake of clarity. Let's assume that they are targeting 30 frames per second at 1080p, just for example. So the thing with dynamic resolution is the game will run at, say, 1080, and if things start to chug and it notices that it takes a long time for it to, and then just basically notice the frame rate starting to drop, then internally the resolution will lower down to 720p. It's actually quite a nice touch. I do quite like that. Anyway, and they were also asked was 1080p the goal ever? And they said it's not really something we set as a mantra. When we first started, there was no platform, it was just on PC, and we were targeting next gen and 1080. Even before that, we thought it would be prohibitive to even consider that, because essentially you have to do everything twice, which is just a massive when you think about it. It's more important that the end image looks awesome, and look how much stuff is on screen. There's always been a Dead Rising sort of brand. And regarding how difficult it is to maintain 720p at 30 frames per second, he said it's been outside of infancy, I'm sorry if I can get the word out. Every new platform launch, I've now learned it's always infancy on tools, and that's the back and forth with the tools improving. It's very similar to PC development environment, so that's been really cool. Happy not to be cross-platform, to be honest. It's a huge challenge for a game like ours. We have to do very specific things with memory allocation and drivers to get our stuff running. And in the past, it was like, wow. It's made our teams quite a bit larger, having multiple leads. Meanwhile, Forza Motorsport 5 creative director from Turn 10, Dan Greenaway, has said, and I quote, in regards to 1080p and 60 frames a second, you don't just happen your way to 1080p. It doesn't matter how much power you have to plan from the beginning. And 60 FPS is even harder. It has to be the culture of your team, that every little aspect of the content, the code, everything has to be developed that way. And you start off with that plan, and you build that plan. We have a bespoke engine that was made for the console, and since we made it for this console, we started off with that plan. It isn't difficult to hit those specs. It's an incredibly powerful console, but it uses DX11, and there's other ways of putting that together, and if we weren't making a bespoke engine, it would have been very difficult. The moment you start making things that has custom made, you can trick the hardware into doing whatever you want. We have a lot more control because we're directly talking to it. He also added the big part of what's going to happen over the next couple of years is going to be the cloud. We're using the cloud for Drivatar. It's asynchronous use of the cloud. Someone may figure out a good synchronous way to use it, but you can't count on someone having a great bandwidth. But someone is going to think of a way to use it asynchronously. There's going to take some of the synchronous work out, and I've got a couple of ideas myself I'm going to hold back in my pockets for a little while. And that's going to offload some of the power. I think that the real gains are going to come from people realizing how better to trick it. Meanwhile, the design director from Crytek on Rise, Son of Rome, which of course is running at 900p, 60 frames per second. Now, what he said is that people were debated the 900 versus 1080p of the resolution for Rise, and it's like, well, we've got the game running at 1080p, it's 30 frames per second, but that's not what matters most. What matters most to us is the art and the quality of what we're doing. I'm sure if we were making a high-end PC game, it would be like, well, not every PC can run at 4K, and we'd be like, well, we're doing it for 4K, it's all relative. At the end of the day, it comes down to the game you're making. Very early on, we said the Rise are going to be very gorgeous next-gen title. We want a deep combat system, and we want to tell a story, and that's what we hedged our bets. He also said that Savagieli from Crytek actually has said in statements that even with the PlayStation 4, it doesn't really matter. They would have made the same design decisions. And the difference between 900p and 1080 is like, well, when some of the best rendering programs in the world, we sit down and look at the difference and we're like, nope, 900p is fine. The difference is infinitesimal, that you're not going to really recognize it. And then you look at the two and you go, well, what do we get for 900p? You have 10 more AI, and then you say sold. To a lot of people, it might seem like an oversimplification, but it's the absolute truth. What's best for your game? Games like shooters, running at 6 frames per second would be important to me because you really don't want that twitch, but you really want that twitch response. So if people choose a lower res and a higher frame rate, then as long as the game is good and looks as beautiful to watch, what they're doing, what they want to hit, then that's fine. You also added, I can guarantee you, if you take a high-end PC running a game and you look at the graphics comparison between that and Rise, you're going to be going, wow, they both look really good. It's about the art. It's less to do with the actual specs and more to do with what you do with those specs. And I've been telling people, guys, this is just the first game. If we can do this in the first game, imagine what we can do with the second generation. Once we get our heads wrapped around what we can do with the cloud. I joke, dude. If I can do 10,000 AI and I can use the cloud to compute the processing power, then you bet your ass you're going to have a battle with 10,000 AI on it. Because that's what we want to do. He also added, technically it is possible. You could do it. It makes a total sense. You have a bunch of really high-end PCs in the cloud to do the cloud computing stuff. It's just a matter of having the right engine and renderer to be able to pull it off. Meanwhile, Gabe Grisani has been speaking on Reddit, and he is one of the game's developers working, or had been working, on Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. And he said that the title was considerably more difficult to work with on the current generation than the next generation. He said, and I quote, development on both next-gen consoles was very smooth since they're both very similar to PCs. The last generation was very difficult, even nightmarish. Both the Xbox One and PS4 very easy to deal with, and the first parties were both there to help out. So, there are other Twitter comments that we could go into, but suffice to say, a lot of the developers are still saying stuff is still embargoed. We remember the Infinity Ward comments from just yesterday. Quite simply put, I don't necessarily, it's very difficult to take certain comments with the same justification of others. Because, for example, Mark Rubin was discussing, well, I don't really agree. I think that John Carmack, for example, wasn't really telling the whole truth when it came to the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. I mean, if you're basically reading between the lines, and quite simply put, developers are under the cosh. They're being told, well, you can't actually discuss this stuff. You can't really say how powerful our systems are. Simple as that. And that's very similar as well to, say, the release dates of even graphics cards for PC. Let's say, for example, you have a new graphics card that's been released. Until the release date, you can't put up a review. So I suppose there's that, but it also kind of gets to the point where it gets a bit silly. Like, people are genuinely curious, and you've got to be honest. I mean, the thing is, this stuff is gonna leak, or it's gonna be released. People are going to know about it. You can't just keep, embargoing footage and that's the end of it, because eventually it's gonna come out, and people, when it does eventually get released, when people eventually see it or hear about it, they're gonna say, what the hell, what's going on? I think at the same time though, there is a lot of frenzy regarding this, and I have said I think that Xbox One is going to end up the weaker of the two consoles, but I don't think that that's anything necessarily bad. I don't necessarily think that that means the end of the console. I don't think that's doom and gloom. I mean, to me, if you want my opinion on what will be doom and gloom for any of the consoles, crappy games. It's that simple. Release a really good console, make sure that it doesn't break, have a great online service, has some good first-party exclusives, and so on and so on, and people will buy the bloody console. And that's pretty much the end of it. Obviously, some people may buy it for optional extras, like some people may like the live streaming of TV. Other people might like it if it can get up in the mornings and make you a coffee. But the reality of the matter is there are, you know, people are going to be judging these things based on the games, I think. And I do think that there is a level of unrealistic expectation. I think the first generation of games are only going to be so good because it is the first generation. Secondly, I'd like to point out that the PlayStation 4 is not this boundless fountain of endless eternal power that I think some people seem to be making it out to be. There is a limit, there is a finite limit on the amount of memory available, the amount of GPU resources available, the amount of CPU resources available, the amount of memory bandwidth available, and so on. It is not this boundless, endless supply. And so, even if you take into account the disparity between the PS4 and the Xbox One, even if you take it on face value that the Xbox One is weaker than the PS4, that doesn't mean that the PS4 versions of games won't be suffering from lower resolutions in the future. We will definitely be seeing 720p, I think, on the PS4's not too distant future as well, on certain games, because that's just what you have to do. Just how it takes more memory for high resolution textures, or it takes more GPU processing power, or whatever, depending on what you're doing. There are always constraints, the same as, say, the AI in Killzone takes a lot of processing power. And no doubt this is going to get better. No doubt as developers get more used to how the next generation systems work, as the tools chains become better, as the ability to learn better rendering techniques, as the ability to figure out, oh, you know what, this bit of code here is maybe superfluous, or this bit of code we can just get rid of that and we can do it this way, which is going to be much better optimization. Or you know what we can do, we can use this technique and it will significantly reduce the amount of memory bandwidth for better anti-aliasing techniques come out. God knows what's going to be on the horizon. But right now, I honestly believe the Xbox One is going to be the more difficult and probably slightly weaker console. Just how much weaker it's unknown. But I think it's very early yet, and I don't think the systems, the games we're seeing are a final indication of what we're going to be seeing in 2, 3, 4 years' time. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video, so I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.